Hello, this is the Provoked Prawn, and in this video I'm showing you how to set up and wire the Lian Li Edge power supply unit. Now this is a particularly interesting PSU which will work in a number of different builds and will make your life a lot easier thanks to not only the unusual setup of where the cables plug in, but also the built-in USB hub. This is a particularly interesting one that I've used inside the NZXT H7 Flow RGB, the specs of which are down below. But you'll notice it's quite a bit different from your standard power supply unit. This is a 1000 watt power supply, so more than enough power for this build. Although I would recommend checking out a power supply unit calculator to make sure that you've got enough juice for your machine if you're using slightly different specs to me. You'll see that there are a number of cables included in the box that we're going to need to connect up. And these are very nice as well because they come with their own cable combs and can be tidied up fairly nicely. We're going to start with the motherboard power supply wiring, so the 24-pin power cable, this large chunky one here, which has one large connector on one side and then two split on the other end at the power supply end. You'll notice these are individually sleeved cables and cable combs, and it's all held together with Velcro tie to start with, which you'll need to remove. But the idea here is that you slide those cable combs around to tidy things up. We also have two 8-pin CPU power connectors, which are marked PSU on one end and CPU on the other. The CPU end obviously plugs into the motherboard. The PSU end goes into the power supply. I'm using a strict motherboard here for demonstration purposes, but what we're going to do is plug the cables in so they're easy for you to see where things connect up, so you can get an idea of how to plug them in when you've finished your build. So for the motherboard power supply cables, we're running it from the motherboard here, 18 plus 10 connectors. So the two parts that are split apart on this side here. And you basically need to plug your cable into that and then run it to the 24-pin power connector on the right-hand side of the motherboard. You'll notice with all these cables, there is a plastic clip on top, which basically ensures that you're plugging it in the right way and that it is held in place once it's fully installed. Now, take note, I'm obviously showing you this beforehand so you can easily see where things are plugged in and connected up, but actually you'd want to do the motherboard side of this wiring once it's all plugged into your case. Now, for the power supply, you actually have an option because you can see where the ports are, so you could theoretically plug the cables in once it's inside the case, but it is easier to do beforehand, I'll show. Now, the 24-pin power cable plugs in on the right-hand side, and it is a little bit fiddly to connect up. You do need to make sure you push it in all the way until it clicks into place, because that little clip will hold it down. But if it is a little bit loose, then your power may not come on, so your PC might not boot up. What you'll see is that you have these cable combs, which obviously you can run and slide along the cables to neaten things up because it is a bit chaotic. But there are several of them throughout that, so when it's in the PC, you can actually really tidy these cables up quite nicely, and they end up looking really neat when you've finished, which is great for cable management and just for keeping things nice and tidy, which is definitely a benefit of this. And all the cables have the same sort of logic. Now we need the two 8-pin CPU power cables, which plug in on the top left of the motherboard. Again, they're marked CPU on one end and power supply on the other end, so that part plugs in to the motherboard. Notice one of them can actually be split apart. Now, depending on your motherboard, you might have different connectors in the top left. You might have two 8-pin power connectors. You might have one 8-pin, or you might have one 4-pin. So you can see that you can split one of these cables in part by just sliding them apart, and then you basically have one connector that you can easily plug in. So I'd recommend connecting these up because they basically allow you to have extra power for your motherboard if you need it for overclocking, which some motherboards will have as standard with AI overclocking or the settings in the motherboard. And this ensures that your motherboard's getting the power it needs, obviously, for the CPU. You can see that they're marked CPU and PCIe ports on the power supply end, so you can plug those into the ports there. And there's a lot of them because also these ports are used for your graphics card as well, which I'll show you a bit later on. You would plug those in on the one side and then run the cables through to the top of the case and plug them in the top left of the motherboard. Most motherboards, you'll find them in the same location at the top left, though it might be worth checking your motherboard manual to make sure, and then you just plug these in and push them down. And again, there's a little plastic clip which holds them in place, so you should feel a click when you do seat them there. And then like with the larger cables, you can also run those cable combs throughout. So you'll see the CPU and PCIe power connectors and the ports that you can put them in and how they set up there. And then a quick close-up view of plugging in for ease there. Naturally, you'd run these cables through once it's all built in your case, but I wanted to show you so it's really easy to see how you connect the power up for your motherboard before sorting it out. Now, with something like the Lian Li SL120 V2s, we need SATA power, and there are two types of SATA power cable in the power supply box. You have this one which has multiple connectors on it, and this connects up to the flat SATA connector that comes out of the fan controller. You'll see that it connects on one end to the SATA and Molex connectors, which are actually at the front edge of the power supply unit. So it runs along that very edge there. And then you have multiple different connectors on here which can plug into the controller. Now there's an L shape to this cable, which means it's difficult to plug in. You can only plug it in one way round, so watch out for that. But as you can see, it's daisy chained with multiple connections on it, so you can plug in multiple cables in there. Some of the Lian Li controllers have multiple SATA connections on them, so you could connect that up quite easily. And then you might have another controller as well, perhaps. Maybe you're throwing in some different fans into the mix, like some TL fans, and then you have some USB cables that you need to plug in. Now, naturally, you've only got two USB connections on the motherboard, but this power supply unit has the ability to connect 4 USB connections to it, and then a single USB connection that comes out for the motherboard signal. So, for example, we can plug in the SL120 V2 controller to this, and the TL controller to this as well, and maybe all-in-one cooler if you've got a USB connection from that, and other things that have an internal USB connection. And then you have a single cable that runs from the power supply unit to the bottom of your motherboard. This is an alternative to having a powered internal USB hub, which will allow you to connect multiple devices, and it makes life a lot easier. So it's actually a fantastic addition to a power supply unit, because if you have multiple different USB things that you need to plug in, that can be a problem. And also with cable management, it makes life easier because you're just running one cable from the power supply directly to the motherboard, and then all the other USB cables just go to the power supply unit. So it's nice and straightforward and really simple to just sort out and wire at the back. And as I said, you can theoretically plug in 4 different things to this controller on the power supply end, and then just have a single cable running out of it connecting up. The other sort of SATA power connector is maybe a bit more flexible and has a bit more length between it, which makes it better suited to the hard disk drives and SSDs. It plugs in with the same sort of logic on that front power connector, and then it'll run off to the SSDs and hard disk drives you want to install and wire up. You can see that it has some length to it, and it maybe not enough. So it really depends on the case, but you can see, unfortunately, I couldn't connect in the same place easily, just one to the other. There is a bit of a gap there, a bit strange, but that's going to depend on the case you're building in. So if you're using this elsewhere, it might not be a problem. But here in this build, it is a little bit of an issue. But you can see we can still connect multiple drives with one cable. Next up, I mentioned the TL series fans require PCIe power. So this is the same connector you'd use for the GPU. So what we're going to do here is plug the power supply unit end, which is clearly marked PSU end, into the power supply, and the same sort of logic as the CPU and power connections we ran earlier on. So that goes in there. And then the other end is a 6-pin connector which plugs into the TL controller. So this is for the TL LCD fans if you plan on using those. I just wanted to demonstrate. If you're using those fans, it needs this sort of power connector, which then just plugs in and clicks into place. This is the same for Corsair's IQ Link system, for example. So some of the fan controllers out there do require PCIe power. The good news is there are a lot of these cables included in the box. So you can see we've got 4 8-pin PCIe power connectors here. And these can be used for your standard graphics cards from AMD, Intel, and older ones from Nvidia as well. They are nice individually sleeved cables, again, with the same sort of cable comb logic as well, so they're nice and easy to keep tidy. And they're split into power supply and PCIe adapters, so you can see which end goes where, with obviously the GPU end being the 6+2 power connector, which you need to pinch together before you push it into the graphics card. we plug the power supply unit end into the port smart CPU and PCIe, as we've done already, and then you'd run the other cable to the graphics card. Now this 3090 requires 2 of these connectors, but obviously you have more cables if you require them for other GPUs. You might have 3 or 4 connectors, for example, that you need to use. You can see that there are some clips on the top of the power port where the plastic clip will sit over the top of it and hold it in place. But be careful to pinch the 2 parts of this power connector together and ensure that they're held together as you push it in, because if the 2-pin part of it becomes loose, that'll mean the GPU is not drawing enough power, and that may result in issues with your graphics card just not performing as it should, and you might see a FPS drop, for example, or even display output not working properly entirely. But for this GPU, that's what the power wiring would look like. 2 cables plugged into the ports, obviously when it's fully installed. Now, it'd be ever so slightly different if you have a more recent GPU like this 4070, for example, which requires an adapter as standard. So it comes with this 12-volt high power adapter, which then plugs into 4 different connectors. You may find your graphics card came with something similar. Basically, the logic here is you pinch the cables together as you would, as I've just shown you, and plug in multiple different connectors there, 3 or 4 of these, into that single cable, which then plugs into the graphics card. Now this is messy and obviously fiddly because you've got to plug a lot of cables in, and probably a problem as well if you're also running fans that require these cables, for example, because you're limited on the number of the cables that you're going to have, so it might present an issue in itself. But more importantly, it just becomes a bit of a faff plugging these all in. The good news is this power supply also has an adapter cable which we can use, which is a 12-volt high power cable, which replaces these 4 cables. So instead of having to deal with all this cable mess in your case and all the cable combs that you'd need to neaten to tidy things up, we can instead replace them entirely with a single cable, which has a 12-volt high power connector, which is a slightly different pinout on both ends. You can see it's marked 600 watt and it has these blue pins on it instead. It plugs into the GPU on one end and the power supply on the other end, and it replaces this adapter so you no longer need to use it. Much, much easier, much neater, and much cleaner for your build as well. So just get rid of the standard power cables, and instead you can see there's a 12-volt high power connection port on the far right hand side of the power supply. You just slot your cable into that, and then the other end goes into your graphics card. So make sure it is pushed all the way in though and fully seated. I did find that was a little bit fiddly, and it is fiddly on both ends, so it just requires pushing in and making sure it's pushed in nicely and that there's no unnecessary pressure from any of the angles. Another cable you might need, although very rarely is it required, is the Molex cable. This is used for a variety of things, including combo reservoirs for custom loop systems, and something like this Razer Chroma RGB controller, which allows you to plug in multiple fans or RGB devices and then connect them to your system and control them with Razer Synapse software. This plugs in to the ports marked SATA and Molex on your power supply unit, and much like the SATA connectors, it has multiple cable connections on it, so you can plug multiple devices into it. It is one of the most fiddly connectors to plug in though. It has one flat edge and one rounded edge, and the pins can bend slightly and be a little bit fiddly to push in, so it might be a struggle to get in there. It's unlikely that you'll need this in your build. I very rarely actually have to use this when I'm crafting PCs, so it really depends on your components, but it's worth watching out for. Now for the installation of the power supply unit in the case. Make sure that the fan is facing outwards where the venting is on your case so that it can breathe and pull cold air into it to keep it cool. You'll notice that I haven't installed the cables on the power supply. Normally I would recommend working out which cables you need for your system and then installing them in the power supply beforehand. And this still is probably worth doing, but because of the design of this power supply unit, you can obviously see where the ports are, and depending on the case, you might be able to easily access them at this point anyway, so you can plug your cables in from here and then run them through the case and plug them in. I've already showed you where to connect up these cables, but I want to show you now how to run them through, think about the logic of it, and also maybe do some cable tidying and set up and just give you the final preparation of the case and the power supply, so that you can get on with building your PC. I've also got an in-depth wiring guide showing you how to connect up every cable in your system, and a playlist which you might find useful, so I'll link to those in the description down below. Now, obviously we're going to do the 24-pin power supply cable here, and we want to make sure that's plugged in the right port and then run up towards the ports on the left hand side, because obviously we're looking at the back, and that will then be on the right hand side of the motherboard when we get there. Take your time to use the cable combs here to neaten things up before you run them through to the front. With this case, it's pretty easy to manage these cables because of various different Velcro ties that we can tie the cable down with so that you can neaten it up before you run it through to the front of the case. And this can be useful because not only make sure you've got plenty of space at the rear once you put in more and more cables, but also it just ensures that it looks nice at the front. With this case, it's actually quite easy to make that hide away quite nicely and look pretty neat because it has this cable hiding tray down the side, but not all cases will have that. And you might find you have various different loops for using plastic cable ties instead of these Velcro ties here. But with this cable, we just run that through to the front and then plug it into the 24-pin port on the right-hand side. Don't forget to push that in until it clicks. If it's loose, your system may not power on, and it could be that simple little problem which is holding you back from having a nice running PC. Now, with the two 8-pin CPU power connectors that I showed before, plug those into the CPU and PCIe ports there. Obviously, they need to be run up to the top right-hand side here if we're looking at the rear of the case. The problem I had with this case, and this will vary depending on what PC case you're building it into, is that these cables aren't very long, which meant that although I could easily run them to the motherboard, if you tried to cable tidy them too much using plastic cable ties and tried to neat them along the very edge of the case, then they simply wouldn't stretch. So what I ended up doing was having a bit of an issue, because if I did do that, then there would have been some overlap over the hard disk drive cage. So it's worth bearing in mind. I would recommend taking my advice here and plugging your cables in first with this setup and then trying to cable tidy them, rather than cable tidying them and then finding that they won't plug in because you've not got enough length in there, because that would obviously be a pain. They plug in the top left hand side of the motherboard, as I've shown before, and I would recommend plugging them both in. This will make sure that you've got enough power, especially if you've got a motherboard that's capable of overclocking, and some modern motherboards will apply overclocking whether you want it to or not as default. So if you've got a high-end CPU, then it makes sense to do this. Obviously, once again, you can use the plastic cable combs, run them around, push a couple towards the edge on the front side to push the cables together and to neaten things up a bit. I did find it was worth using a couple of plastic cable ties at the bottom of these cables. Although I didn't want to tie them directly to the case, I did find this helped to neaten things up a little bit, and managing the cables, making sure they're nice and neat, is beneficial in other ways because it will keep them out of the way of other things. But if I'd tightened these up too much, it would have stopped me from being able to remove the hard disk drive cage, which I ended up wanting to do later on, and to do other things. There are plastic cable ties included, and then you can just snip them once you've installed them and make sure that everything is nice and neat and looking good back there. Then the SATA power connectors. So again, don't forget there's two of these, one with multiple connections on a short distance and then one that's split a bit further. This is better here for the hard disk drives and SSDs, because you'll notice we've got a bay at the bottom of the case with SSDs in it, and then on the right hand side there's a hard disk drive and SSD there as well. So you can actually run this cable in two different directions and plug in those drives really easily and connect those up. Obviously, that's important to make sure these drives are powered. Although if you're sticking with NVMe SSDs and you don't have any of these drives, then you don't need this cable and life's a lot easier. The cabling is a little bit fiddly. Don't forget it's got that little L-shaped connector on it, so there is a notch there you need to watch out for when plugging it in. And the distance between the drives may impact how easy it is to plug multiple drives in. As you can see here, one of the connectors won't stretch down to the SSD, so I have to use one that's below that. Not a major problem, and it will vary from case to case depending on the bays that you're using and how they're installed into the case. So this is quite specific to this H7 Flow RGB, but I thought it was worth highlighting. And then just make sure you tidy up those cables as you go to keep this space nice and neat, because you will end up with quite a mess by the end, quite probably. For the graphics card cables, you can probably run them from below the GPU. You can see on this case, you can run the 2 cables from underneath through a couple of ports there. Don't forget what I mentioned earlier on. Make sure you pinch those cables together when you're trying to plug them into the connector, and that they all go in. If this cable is loose in any way, this is where it splits apart particularly, and it isn't fully seated, you might see simple things like FPS drops, maybe your display won't work properly, or just performance is not that good, and this could be the issue, just simply the power cable isn't all the way in. But you can then neaten these cables up, make the use of the cable combs and tidy them up as much as possible, and then you've got a finished build. So here we are at the end of the build. I've hopefully helped you out and shown you all the different ways you can wire things in and the things to think about while doing it. Don't forget to check the links in the description to see more useful content on this, and let me know down below if I helped out, and thanks very much for watching. You've made it right to the end of the video, you brilliant legend you. If you've enjoyed it, click that subscribe button, give me a thumbs up, and drop me a comment down below if you've got any questions. If you really enjoyed it, consider joining the channel and see the benefits of doing so. Check out these other videos, you might well find them interesting or useful, and most importantly, have a great life.